Safiya. How you doing today?
I'm great. Amar, how are you?
I'm doing pretty well. Yeah, in these chaotic times, as I'm sure you know, it's really
I'm great.
rough out here. But for those who might not be familiar with your work, if that's even possible, can you tell me how you developed your interest and practice in understanding how culture intersects with technology?
Sure. Okay. Well, I've been working on culture my whole career. Even before I was an academic and a scholar, I worked in the culture industries of advertising and marketing, which probably are some of the biggest culture makers there are. I worked just specifically in African American and urban marketing. And before that, I worked in politics around communities of color, which also obviously shapes culture. And then about 15 years ago, I started studying um, a big online platform that was kind of nascent at the time called Google. And I started writing about the outsized influence that Google and other uh, search technology companies have in shaping our knowledge and information ecosystem. So much so outsized, in fact, now that they're more trusted and have become relied upon more by the public than other, um, legacy knowledge systems like libraries and schools and universities and parents and experts. So, yeah, I'm super fascinated at how it is that a monopoly tech companies can completely remake our understanding of the world, of politics, of ourselves, of culture, and what that means when we cede so much of our reliance to advertising tech, which ultimately is what those projects are. And yeah, so that's what I write about and study. And I guess that has that culminated at one point in a book called Algorithms of Oppression, and continues with essays and things that I write to that effect.
And, key part of your argument is both that this is a corporation and that there's like a technology that they use to distribute information that seemingly doesn't serve your communities, my community, our communities. How do you define those communities and how are platforms not serving them, us?
Yeah, well, one of the challenges, when I was, I guess, 2010 is when I first started studying in earnest Google and YouTube and other kinds of projects. Uh, there were a couple of things that were happening back then. And, people may not remember unless they were also studying digital media at the time, because now, today, we have common sense understandings that these projects are failing us or failing society, but or that they're algorithmically driving certain kinds of outcomes, profit being probably the most important, obvious one, but other kinds of political values that they either foreground or suppress. But back then, the word algorithm was jargon for computer scientists and information scientists. I'm an information scientist. And this was not part of our everyday lexicon. We didn't have algorithms as a word we would reach for and talk about, like at the dinner table with your kids or with your parents or something. And so, my work, I think, was really about trying to situate that algorithms or this type of AI is a cultural phenomena, that it is actually a practice that is doing something. It is not just a mathematical formula that is driving computing, and kind of computing deliverables. And, so now we understand these differently. And I was part of the kind of, I think, first wave of scholars who was saying, like, actually, algorithms are political, they are value based, they are laden with they're programmed in particular ways. They're not just math, they're far more than math. And because they're more than math, they have to be studied as a social practice, right? An economic practice and a political practice. So I would say that, that's an important part of, my contribution as a scholar and as a person who's kind of thinking about that. More specifically, I was concerned with how they are actually imbued with a lot of racist and sexist values that have discriminatory outcomes. And both in like how people get misrepresented in a search engine, probably the most, notable way in which I talked about that in those early years is like when you would do searches on Black girls or Latina girls or Asian girls, you would get almost exclusively pornography back in these search engines. And you didn't have to add the word sex or porn. Girls of color and women of color were synonymous with pornography. So that was like one of the biggest exemplars, right? That I originally, but then there were many, many other, dozens and dozens of other, discriminatory or harmful or misrepresentative kinds of effects of the way that algorithms were working in search technologies. And that has a big impact on people and on communities. And so I was really interested in talking about that. I still am interested in talking about that. But now, of course, we have thousands of ways that we can point to how algorithms and AI are harmful in many dimensions, many different ways, and the problems are actually exponentially worse today, I think, than with substantially more harmful outcomes than in 2010. And fortunately as well, we have many more people writing about and researching that.
Yeah, I think everyone remembers that kind of core case study in the book of just like Googling such a simple phrase. And I think in the book you were with maybe your niece or something as well.
My daughter.
And sorry.
Yeah, and my daughter.
And your daughter. And so just like, something that they would have Googled. And it was kind of remarkable that Google never picked up on that, like, and I think they've since fixed it after you kind of raised the issue, but that seems more like a cosmetic thing that hasn't really changed the underlying architecture of so much of our technology. So I want to ask, like, what are the challenges that, I don't know, thinkers, organizers, cultural producers, regular people interested in diversity or inclusion or just equity, what are they facing with these algorithms? What's going on under the hood?
Yeah, it's really true. I mean, I was thinking about, my daughter at the time was a tween, and our nieces, and I was always kind of thinking about what happens when they're on our computers and doing their thing, hanging out online, and so there's a couple things that I believe are happening. Yes, it's true that Google took my book, as did other companies, I'm sure, and it was like a big book of tickets, and they were like, some software engineers had to like go fix this, but you can't really fix these things because the underlying architecture and structure of search technologies, and I would say by extension, social media technologies too, is that these technologies, these algorithms it's not just like one line of code. We're talking about now decades of code that even the engineers in these companies, the software engineers will say they're not entirely sure how they work or how they get these outcomes, right? So whether it's in search technologies where, they've interviewed many times software engineers and they're like, we're not really sure. So what they have to do is they have to downrank troubling, artifacts that come to the top. And they do that and they content moderate, which is what we kind of understand, search results all over the world in all the places where they do business, because they have to comply with the laws of the countries. So if you're in France and Germany, for example, you cannot have Nazi or neo-Nazi imagery or artifacts rise to the top in any kind of digital platform. That's against the law. That's illegal. 20 Ways to Sunday. So you have to constantly downrank that because people are trying to game the system to get those things made visible. In the US, that might be legal, but there are other things that might be considered illegal or are illegal, like child sexual exploitation or other kind now non-consensual intimate imagery, right? That is going to have to be taken down. So you have a kind of a content moderation that's happening in search and social media kinds of technologies. So that architecturally, the systems are too big to be effectively fixed, okay, around whatever the values are of a governing society or regulatory body. You also, though, have what's very dangerous, I think, for people who are interested, like in the, culture and, multicultural, let's say, representation, fair representation for everyone. Okay. I don't mean just like multiculturalism as like a political project, but I mean, like, can everyone be fairly represented on the terms they want to be represented by? Well, that's very difficult to do because by the very nature of a logic of universal appeal and universal design, which if you study things like human computer interaction and this idea of doing universal design, it means you are just by nature, you're looking for the lowest common denominator in common among all people and communities, and you're imagining that as the ideal user, and that is what you're designing around. And of course, people are broad and different and interesting. So you're not designing for, let's say, thousands of different cultures and communities that might use. You're looking for more of like a narrow. And when you do that, you fall into, of course, a lot of debilitating traps, quite frankly, as a design principle. So we're dealing with these things that are like structurally flawed. And unfortunately, those logics now are the bedrock of new forms of artificial intelligence from which, let's say, AI or large language models are built on these already kind of broken systems, not broken for everyone, but broken for many kinds of projects. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why many culture makers find themselves, let's say, making content and putting it into these systems, Instagram or YouTube or other kinds of digital platforms, and they can't figure out why they can't get visibility because the system isn't really designed for your niche kind of content or community. It's designed for this like universal user, which just, defaults to, a very generic kind of user that usually is tested among other Silicon Valley workers, right? So if the Silicon Valley workforce, let's say, is largely men who are white and maybe Asian, and they're testing it at work to see like, how does this, okay, so their test environment already is narrow, and that is who they see as like themselves as the proxies for society. And by doing that, then their taste, their interests, what appeals to them or doesn't, is going to fall in or out. And, nothing could be like a better example of this than when Twitter started, and our friend and colleague Andre Brock writing about Black Twitter, how in the early days of Twitter, it was like a message board it used in Silicon Valley workplaces where people could talk to each other kind of publicly. And they would do that all day at work. And then they'd go home. And at night, all the young Black teenagers would get on Twitter and start chopping it up with each other. And then the Silicon Valley workers would come back the next morning and they're like, what just happened? What's going on in here? They used it wrong. This isn't how you use Twitter, right? Because in their imaginary and in their experience of how they used it, it was what it was. And then Twitter became a global phenomena because all of these culture makers came on in the night and overnight and in other countries and used it and invented hashtagging as a way to organize their conversations and actually made it something completely different than what it was designed to be. So, these are the rubs I think that we experience and we find, and even at the end in the final analysis, even with a platform like that, what we see is that then that company can be privately sold from one set of private hands to another, and the entire agenda and project be shifted and changed and taken right out from underneath us. So that's also one of the other kind of challenges of these monopoly companies being the site of cultural production is they're not actually our sites. We don't own them. We don't control them. We don't have a stake in them. And if we build our culture in them and on them, it can actually go down just like that, as is happening.
Yeah, wow, you just said so many great things there. I love how you kind of started us with this idea of fair representation, which I think is better than DEI as a framework because everybody represents themselves or should be able to. But like you said, the idea behind all these technologies is trying to like winnow away all the messy edges to get to the thing that's like the lowest common denominator, the easiest to serve, the easiest to target and sell to. But that always leads to some problems. When I teach your book, I usually do an update where I do hashtag Black girls, hashtag Latina girls, and have students search for that on Instagram, and then we show up the top results. And it's not pornography because, like you said, they've kind of winnowed that out because it's not. Also, advertisers don't like it, right? But like, you get all these like conventionally attractive women that basically look like, models for sex sites, and then one of my students in a class recently tried to make an AI film as an experiment, and it was about feminism, and she couldn't make female characters that weren't conventionally sexy, So like you said, it kind of, all these technologies are algorithmic and they kind of have been building each other on each other. So it seems like we just keep losing, right? There's just no point to kind of intervene and change the representational dynamics that are like now so deeply embedded. Like you said, these guys don't even know how it works, which is always wild to me that they say it so transparently. They're just like, and they say it about AI all the time, they just don't know
They don't know. And they're like, I don't know, let's build it and hope for the best. And I'm like, wait, what? It's kind of like just because you can do a thing doesn't mean you should. All right. And so for some reason, that memo hasn't made it to Silicon Valley. We have a saying in our community, all money ain't good money, right? Because we understand that the short-term gains may actually ruin things for the long term. So, we have a sensibility. We have these, I don't know, these like adages or axioms that we use to help us have a sense of the now and the future. And I think you're absolutely right. It's like we have to we understand a lot of things that have been abandoned for the profit motive. So for example, we know things about security, cybersecurity, computing security. We know that decentralized networks and models are more secure than centralized models, right? That can be hacked into. We know that like this like distributed way of computing, and yet everywhere we go, everyone's centralizing or building monopolies or forcing us into like 2 or 3 computing systems, right? So there's so many things, like there's so many other pathways that we could have taken, let's say from the 90s computing culture to today. But those were, but we didn't have the people power like we had in the 90s around computing to stay in a kind of like vanguard around setting the computing infrastructure agenda for the United States and beyond. And so we're incredibly vulnerable now as a society, not just in terms of cybersecurity, where we are, but also just the idea that putting everything into computing systems, including culture, but also every decision that is central to our lives, and seeding all the decision making around whether we get into school or not, whether we get a mortgage or not, whether we can get credit or not, whether we meet somebody we want to have intimate relationships with or not. Like, I mean, so many things. We've just ceded to computing and computers, but see, there could be other ways. And we risk a lot because when we put ourselves and our human agency and the decisions that affect our lives into these systems that are, quite frankly, not designed for us or by us, we put a lot at risk.
Yeah. How do we get there? How do we develop social media technology in ways that enable for collective power, collective action, collective storytelling in ways that aren't harmful? Maybe another way to ask that is like, so there's a top-down question, like how do we get there institutionally? And then maybe there's a bottom-up, like how do we as communities develop the practices, the protocols, the platforms to do that?
Well, I would say, I mean, you are our greatest storyteller of putting the voices that we need so desperately to hear, into the zeitgeist for us. And, I don't know, I always feel like start with you, to be quite honest, because you have, you've understood that we actually have to have our own platforms and communities, and we can make our own kind of pro-social tech. And so I feel like you have been one of the earliest innovators in this area. And it's so amazing just seeing how you move in the world and how you've modeled and how you have um, enriched our community and our culture so profoundly online. So that's the first thing. I just want to give you your flowers because we know what you have done for us, and people should be coming and sitting at your feet and taking the class and understanding like how did you do it, and teach us. So I think, that's what I think of, like from the grassroots, that we do have the agency, and you have demonstrated to us what our agency can look like so beautifully. I think there are others as well. I look at what our friend and colleague, Timnit Jabru has done with DARE and the Distributed AI Research Network, and how, she's building this federation of pro-social tech companies and projects and initiatives, mostly outside of the United States, to preserve language, of languages that are being threatened, and using AI to help preserve language, and to understand, what an anti-surveillance tech landscape could look like, and what does anti-surveillance tech, what could it be, and how could we imagine it? And so she's got just, the work that I think she and Alex Hanna are doing and their collaborators is phenomenal and inspiring. Again, with like localized control over data, and really thinking about what it means to have decentralized technology. So I like love what they're doing. I think from above, if you will, I don't know, maybe it's not above, but like, except like in our overlords kind of way, but like, okay, from like in terms of power, people with more power in terms of capital, you know, uh, part of the challenge here has been that there have been a number of us who I think our critiques and our research and our demonstrations have opened up the zeitgeist to the fact that yes, tech can be harmful, which again, I'm going to tell you 15 years ago, nobody was saying that tech could be harmful. Okay. There was just only a pro and no cons. So we've demonstrated like where the cons are, not because our sport is showing the harms and that we just want to be like negative people, which I believe is how we get cast, but because we actually love our communities. We are technologists ourselves. We are high-powered tech users ourselves. We have degrees in technology, and we care about society. We care about civil rights. We care about human rights, and we want to see these things used in ways that are, powerful and conscientious and careful and meaningful, and that afford us those civil and human rights and help us build strong, healthy democracies and societies and communities and address inequality and all of the things we all care about. And the people who've been resourced, though, are not that community, not of us. So here we are somehow cast as critics, which nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, I know that's what we are, but like what we are the people who are saying, but what about these possibilities, this whole realm of possibility? And we're the least resourced in the ecosystem. And the people who are not mindful, don't care about these things, are quite reckless, in fact, have been over-resourced and over-invested in to the point of absurdity. And that comes from powerful people who have resources to invest in them. And so I think, this idea of like that, we don't have like the equitable investment in the ecosystem for us to be at the forefront of building and contributing pro-social tech is a real missing. It's a really big missed opportunity right now. And so I'm just spending a lot of my time trying to talk to investors, philanthropy, family offices, like lots of different kinds of people about why not invest in us and our kind of pro-social vision around the tech industry. We should be resourcing you and, lots of people that we know. And we also, because, for you and I, we are scholars. So we have this huge pipeline of students that we see that have brilliant ideas that actually get beta tested in the university. But unlike the students who are at Stanford and have ideas, and they just walk across the street to Sand Hill Road and go to Y Combinator, go to these places and get put into a machine that then spits out maximum profit, and like the values get stripped out because who cares? And they get lots of money, even without writing down an idea on a piece of paper, like just from a concept, just from a conversation. We're over here with like deep proposals and, nickels, right? So I think that is a model from on high, if you will, that is time for reinvention. And we're ready to go.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like I once taught just Facebook to one of my students, to one of my classes, and the amount of money Facebook got before they even had a revenue model, it was well over $1 billion, and there's just no way a woman, a person of color is getting that much money without actually way more evidence that their thing works, let alone the fact that they might be sacrificing profit for actual social development. You might need a longer runway. Like that's not even in the conversation. So
where's the runway? Yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, most of us just have enough runway to have, small scale centers or labs and which is amazing and important. I mean, I'm not looking a gift horse in the mouth, but I'm also just saying that you can't do the kind of longitudinal important work without real resources at your back.
Yeah.
It's just not possible. I mean, developers are expensive, but then when you talk about the kind of systems level thinking that we need, that's at the intersection of social science, humanities, and technologists, that those models, we have them. We've already prototyped them inside the university. We know what they need to be, but they're not resourced in the way that we need in order to. I can just tell you, and it's so interesting because when I try to raise money for these things, it's so the feedback, I have to tell you, this is just the truth. I mean, I have had people say to me, Safiya, the case that you make with like all your credentials and all the credentials of your team and all of the background and the bona fides, like, um, it's kind of sad because your basically white male counterparts, they don't have any of that, and they don't even lean on that, and they don't have to lead with that to prove that they're worthy. And of course, me and the women of color, we're leading with that to say you can trust us. We're credentialed. We know what we're doing, and so that stings, to know that. And then at the end of the day, we still don't really get the big checks cut yet. So, we're trying to figure out what is it besides truly not being a person of color or a woman that gets you resourced? And these are hard questions that it would be helpful to have answers to.
Yeah, wow. I mean, thank you for that candor, because I think some people would think, oh, but like certainly for people like you, it's easy, like it's really depressing and aggravating. And I love how you talked about how sometimes scholars get framed as just critics when I feel like nobody talks about the parts of your book that are about imagining otherwise, like people, it seems like people don't actually want to imagine otherwise. Like maybe they're scared or they just think it's not possible or something.
Maybe
There's
they didn't read the whole book. Maybe they just read like the it's read like the first 50 pages. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's true. The book ends on imagining a different kind of search technology and interface, which has been a dream of mine to be able to experiment and build. And, I have laid down so many tracks for the partnerships that could enable it, that just require the dollars. And no one's ever been interested. In fact, Timnit is always the one who's like, when are we going to build your search engine? And I'm always like, I think everybody forgot that I proposed a way forward even on that. So, and that was all about public interest search. That's what I called it. I called it public interest search. This is the first time I said that phrase was like in the dissertation.
wow.
And that got deposited in 2012.
Wow.
And the whole field, even of public interest technology, has been raised up. And I don't think anybody remembers that I said, let's build a public interest search engine back then. So,
Somewhere out there, there's an Afrofuturist tale about what if people had actually just funded it when you wrote it, and where would we be now with AI? Because as you mentioned, like all these technologies have built on each other, and the fact that we never imagined otherwise earlier is why we're here now, where now we have AI slop everywhere, and it's just probably gonna destroy us all. So
if it doesn't destroy the environment and the planet first, I mean, that's actually like, it's destroying culture and people's, sense of work and reliability. And, I don't know, will it go by the way of the 8-track or the CD? One can only hope. I don't know. You know what I'm saying? But obviously, many of these projects are just a quick money grab. because they really are snake oil, and they're not reliable enough to run a country or run a society or run a multi-billion-dollar business on. Many of these technologies have been developed, especially in the realm of chatbots, looking still for a buyer, and many companies are not buying. And of course that means they come over here to our sector, to education, and to the public, public goods, public institutions. We were not the intended market for these chatbots, but now somehow we're supposed to run universities with them. And I'm like, well, American Airlines didn't want it, or whatever, like whatever company they imagined they were building these for, to reduce the labor force to next to nil. Now you want to come over and reduce like our labor force with that? I don't think so. So it's interesting. If you take a systems, like a market approach, you look at like the market, and where there hasn't been a market for these technologies, and where they're searching for markets. Now, guess what? It's where working class kids are going to school, and it's public school, and it's those places where these technologies are getting sold into. And I just find that like par for the course. This is why it's so important to have scholars and historians and social scientists and humanists at the table, because we can recognize what this is and what this means, and can maybe steer the ship in a little bit of a different direction.
Whew. I mean, one day we should talk offline about the snake oil salesman that is Sam Altman, and like his like many schemes to raise trillions of dollars on really just seems like speak, honestly. And then the discourse that like young kids of color are like falling behind, when like AI actually stops you from critical thinking, and I think makes you dumber because you offload your thinking to the machine. So it's just so it's so depressing. Yeah.
Well, how about the vaporware? Like, one of the guys who left OpenAI, getting billions of dollars to work on AGI, which is a scam and not real. And to like here's some money to like work on it and not release it. Like,
right, that guy.
In what world do you get billions of dollars to work on a thing that's never gonna see the light of day? Like, I just like, this is where I mean, obviously we don't want Saudi sovereign wealth funds, and we don't want blood money in this truest rawest sense of it, funding the kinds of projects that we are interested in doing. But I will say that the fact that everyday people's pensions are being put up as the money to back the vaporware out here in the tech, or just straight up harmful tech, because the LPs who give the money to venture capital are giving over the teachers' pensions, are giving over the nurses' pensions. Like, I don't think that people really understand how the system works. Where does the venture capital money come from? It comes from everyday working people that are then their money is being invested in something that will in fact allegedly take away their jobs, or certainly threaten and make their jobs more difficult. Like, these are the types of analyses we have, because we do understand how the ecosystem works. And I think teachers, if they're going to be forced to use technology in certain ways that, like, and maybe not forced is too wrong, but if they're going to adopt, let's have it be in a way that, again, is pro-social, that doesn't undercut their own lives and retirement and sense of future, and and doesn't put students, and their privacy and their futures, in the crosshairs. Like, there's so many beautiful, interesting ways to imagine doing things that aren't the way that we're doing them now.
And that brings me to my next and almost last question, which is, when you think about other ways of doing things that don't necessarily, like, let's say, forget the money and all that stuff, just the ways that you think about the most basic, most healing forms of technology. Sometimes I use the word cultural protocols, rituals and just things in your everyday life where you're like, this is how I do things that are good for me, and my community, my family. Are there lessons from that you think we can take with us as we try to wrap our heads around what's a different way of organizing our society? Does that make sense? It's a little bit of a weird, weighty question, but like, are there cultural protocols that you think communities use to feel secure and connecting with each other that you think we can take with us, that are values that we can take with us?
Well, I definitely think that one of our superpowers is convening, meeting up, being together, hanging out, being at the cookout, like the things that we do that are you had to be there kinds of experiences. In my community, in our community, I think like these are some of the richest, most like delicious aspects of living. We had a party, we gathered around all kinds of things with the family, with the community in many different registers. And what happens there is just deep exchange. It might happen through vibes. It might happen through conversations. It might happen at the card table. It might happen slapping a bone. There might be all kinds of ways that we get regrounded, reconnected, recommitted. We leave so high and full of life and vibrant and energized, and that carries us. I'm just speaking for myself. This is how I live. And I think of that as like a protocol, or like, my house is like my husband and I, we always, no matter if we've lived in a 650 square foot apartment, we have 80 people in there for a party. You know what I'm saying? Like it was spilling out into the front yard. Like we know that gathering and being together is like, it's the thing that makes life worth living. And I think like, to me, protocols that remind us that life is worth living. And that comes through community and connection and just being with your people, whoever those people are. That is the one thing that I believe ultimately AI robs us. It flattens our human experience. It homogenizes. It takes the good vibes out, and it becomes transactional and sometimes unidirectional, and the synthetic intimacies that we have with social media and chatbots. I worry about that because we see what can come of that, which can be incredibly harmful and isolating and, kind of like dark in some ways, right? A lower vibe. I'm so LA. I'm so California. I'm a native Californian, so to speak. So I roll in vibes too. And I just think those are the things to me that I'm always in, like, that's the tension where the predictive analytics flatten our experience and always keep us rooted in the past and narrow and miscategorize and misunderstand our lives, and then predict the kind of worst dimensions of the past into the future. Being together actually catalyzes all kinds of new things and new aspects of us. We leave different from interactions with some people, and some, like, this is why we love art, or the theater, right? Or, your web series, or like, I just watched Forever. And so I'm like completely transformed, right? Because that's like my show. And so the transformative protocols that make us a different person because we experienced that, or we experienced each other, that is what AI cannot give us. I believe it can give us something, but it also thinks of us as the person we were yesterday. But you don't know that I just talked to Amar today, and now I'm different because coming out of that conversation, I'm a different Safiya from having had that experience. And the algorithm doesn't know that.
Oof, that was so, yeah, I have chills because I just feel like you're asking the question of what if we designed technology so that we knew that when we left it, we were transformed in a way that made us better the next day, that made us feel better, that made us get through. And so often our engagement with social media, and I think I haven't done it, but I would assume any kind of AI chat bot, influencer, AI film, it might satisfy you in the moment while you're doing it, but so many people report leaving that feeling emptier, And I think the compounding effects of that over the years is going to be really detrimental to society and our social fabric. And I think you're inviting us to start from a different place that I think, unfortunately, it seems like tech companies won't do, in part because they grew up as advertising companies. And so much of advertising logic, I'm sure, as you remember, is like you actually want people to feel bad because then they'll buy to feel better, right? So, like,
Absolutely. 100%.
that's
Hey,
true, right?
yeah, don't you want to smell fresher? Get some Tide. Don't you want to be cooler? Get this Hummer. Don't you want to be glamorous? Smoke the cigarette. Like you name it. I mean, have a Coke and a smile. I don't know. Like we know, but it's actually more nefarious, in fact, because with the relationship between the tech industry and the nation state governments around the world and the incredibly lucrative industry that is a surveillance industry. And now you're talking about not only does ad tech want to like make money, but governments also want to control populations. And in many cases, they want to control whom they think of as undesirable populations. And here again, people like us might fall into those categories, especially now, right now in the United States. So, it's this idea of what gets made and to what ends it gets used. I think part of the reason why a lot of people don't even understand that is because they don't understand the history, that maybe they're not part of communities that have been surveilled and controlled. And here we are now, we're full circle at Simone Brown's work, Dark Matters, in the history of surveilling African Americans or Black people in the Americas, and to control our labor and our lives. And you and I we are, my grandparents were my grandfather was sold to a white man in Philadelphia, which is how he came to be from Philadelphia. He was from the Gullah Islands. And when he was a little boy, around 5 or 6, my dad told me he was sold to a white man. And eventually he was like emancipated from that around 16. My grandmother was born into sharecropping, which is basically legalized enslavement continuing. So we are barely out of that experience, but they knew what it meant to be born into a type of bondage and have their lives and their labor and everything about them and their families controlled by others, owned by others. If you don't have that experience or that family lineage, you're not even thinking about what it means for surveillance systems to control your move and what you can do. And so those things, I think, again, we can use our tragedies, and not just ours, but lots of communities around the world understand what it means to be marked in particular ways, and then deported or incarcerated or not allowed to cross borders, all kinds of things. So there's a lot to learn about how we could live differently in a free way, and how to make the control over other people's lives in these ways not profitable.
Yeah.
That is important work, important work too, that we're doing.
Absolutely. We could end there, but I do have two unfair questions
Okay.
that that require short answers that you are free to
Okay.
because they are unfair, which is what is one specific thing? It could be a design feature, a cultural practice, a platform policy that you love about social media or other technology that you think we can continue into the future, that we can keep, and what's one thing you would change?
This is like a very hard question because I'm not in love with social media. Um, I do appreciate hashtags as a way of finding things. And, I guess I'm more like the young people now who use hashtags also as like a searching mechanism. Um, and I like that people are organizing the things they have to say with hashtags so that we can use social media more like a search engine. So when there are topics that I'm looking for more information on, I do try to like imagine like, okay, what are the experts in this? What are they using as a hashtag to organize that conversation? And then I can go hear from like 50 people talking about that thing, which I actually enjoy more than a search engine giving me a rank order of websites. I want to hear from people and their testimony. So I do like that feature, and I would keep that. Um, and something that we would change. I mean, I would definitely change the addictive dimensions of social media because I feel like a lot of life force is given, a lot of time is given to scrolling and doom scrolling in particular. And if I could change something, it would be like, what's in there that has like the clickbait dimensions of social media, like couldn't it be something that isn't addictive like a cigarette, but is more like, um, you know, um, a nice little ritual that we participate in, like making our coffee in the morning and we check something out, and then we move on with our day. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. You answered it. It was fine. You did it. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to speak with me and share your wisdom. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. You're amazing. And thank you so much. I just wish the best for you and all your work.